He knocked on his neighbor's door and asked to borrow £2. In the next room lay his dead 1-year-old daughter, and he didn't even have money for a coffin. He'd already buried 2 children before this. And he was the author of a book that would turn the world upside down. Karl Marx. He was born in 1818 in Trier in a house on Bridge Street. The family lived in 10 rooms with 2 servants and a vineyard outside town. But his father, Heinrich Marx, wasn't rich by nature. He was born Herschel Levy in a family of rabbis, got a law degree, and then Napoleon lost and the Rhineland was handed to Prussia. Prussia brought back the old law. Jews couldn't hold government posts. Heinrich was denied an exception. In 1817 or 1818, he got baptized Lutheran, changed his name, saved his career. Karl was baptized when he was 6. His mother, Henriette, waited another year until her own father died. Baptism in this family wasn't an act of faith, it was an act of survival. You can imagine the boy figured out early. Religion isn't about the soul, it's about permission to live in society. At school in Trier, the principal was his father's friend, a liberal and a Kantian. Police kept tabs on the school, found it suspicious. Karl studied 5 years, then left for Bonn. There he fought a duel, got a cut above his left eye, spent a night in jail for drunkenness and hooliganism, ran a beer club and a poet society. His father wrote urging him to transfer to stricter Berlin, or beer and duels would ruin him. Karl moved in the fall. There he dropped law, got hooked on Hegel's philosophy, joined the young Hegelians, the ones who drew atheism and revolution out of Hegel's system. He didn't go to his father's funeral when Heinrich died of tuberculosis. Karl stayed in Berlin. You can imagine he couldn't go back to that world where the father got baptized for his career and the son refused to get baptized for his idea. In Berlin, he met Jenny von Westphalen. She was 4 years older, from an aristocratic family, daughter of the Prussian official Ludwig von Westphalen, who'd been friends with Karl's father. Jenny and Karl had known each other since childhood. They got secretly engaged when he was 18, married only 7 years later, when both fathers were dead. Jenny broke off her previous engagement to an aristocrat. She chose a broke student with no prospects over him. Like if today a governor's daughter left a bureaucrat for a freelancer writing about how to burn the system down. Right after the wedding, they left for Paris. There, Karl got a job as editor at the Franco-German yearbook. The first and only issue came out in spring. Sales tanked. The journal folded. But that same year, late summer, at a cafe on the corner of Vannes Street in Paris, Karl met Friedrich Engels. They talked 10 days and nights straight. Engels was a factory owner's son from Manchester, but he hated the factory hell he'd seen working at his father's firm. They agreed on everything. From that moment on, Engels would be the only person keeping Marx alive financially for the rest of his life. In Paris, their first daughter was born, Jenny. All daughters got their mother's name. But French authorities expelled Marx as a dangerous revolutionary, and the family moved to Brussels. There, over 2 years, Karl and Friedrich wrote The German Ideology, a book they couldn't get published in their lifetimes. Jenny copied her husband's illegible manuscripts, handled correspondence, sat in on communist committee meetings. She was the first woman admitted to the League of the Just, which later became the Communist League. In the early 40s, a commission asked them to write a program. The Communist Manifesto was ready in 6 weeks. Jenny copied the fair draft. Soon revolution broke out in France, then Germany. Marx returned to Cologne, launched the new Rhenish Gazette. But the revolution lost. In spring, the Prussian government expelled him. Third country in 5 years. They decided to go to London. They arrived in summer. Karl was 31, with a wife, 3 kids, and a maid, Lenchen, whom Jenny had brought from Trier. First they rented in Camberwell, then got evicted for debt. Moved to 2 rooms on Dean Street in Soho, London's poorest district. There was no money for food. Sometimes they ate nothing but potatoes for weeks. Jenny sold furniture to buy medicine. Karl wrote articles for the Chartist newspaper and the New York Daily Tribune, but they paid peanuts and the money came months late. In November, their son Henry Guido, called Foxy, died. He was just over a year old. He died from convulsions that had tormented him since birth. Karl wrote Engels, "The little fellow of the gunpowder plot died at 10 this morning. A few minutes before, he was still laughing and joking." Jenny breastfed the baby, though her nipples were bleeding. At the same time, she was pregnant again. Their daughter Francisca was born the following spring. A year later, she got bronchitis. 3 days the child fought, then died. The family had no money for a coffin. Jenny knocked on the neighbor's door asking for £2. They laid the body on a table in the next room and slept on the floor in the hallway because there was nowhere else to lie. Have you ever believed the world was fair until it took someone who didn't deserve it? 3 years later, their 8-year-old son Edgar, Mush, died. He died in his father's arms from consumption. At the funeral, Wilhelm Liebknecht sat next to Marx in the carriage. Karl was silent, face in his hands. Liebknecht said, "More, you have a wife, daughters, we're all here." Marx answered, "You won't give me back my boy." When they lowered the coffin, friends were afraid he'd jump in after it. In 7 years in London, 3 of 4 children died. Only Eleanor, Tussie, born the year her brother died, survived along with 2 older sisters. You can imagine Karl blamed poverty. He wrote Engels that his children fell victim to bourgeois misery. But he didn't quit working. He kept going to the British Museum reading room almost every day, sat at his desk, filled out slips, read economists, statistics, factory reports. He wrote that capitalism turns labor into a commodity and the worker into an appendage of the machine. He himself never worked a day in a factory. He himself lived on Engels's money, who worked at his father's textile firm in Manchester and hated it. Engels sent £5 a week, then 10, then more. Without that money, the Marx family wouldn't have lasted a week. And here's the strange contradiction nobody talks about. Marx built a theory where everything is determined by economic relations. Whoever owns the means of production rules the world. But Marx's own life broke that scheme. For 30 years he lived off one man, not because economic relations worked out that way, but because Engels decided friendship and ideas matter more than money. Marx wrote that under communism, private property, family, religion would wither away. Everything people consider sacred. But he himself was bound to a wife who copied his manuscripts and endured poverty. He loved the children he buried. He carried his father's daguerreotype in his pocket, the father he never buried. Theory said the personal is illusion. Life proved the personal is all that remains when theory goes silent. A few years later, the family moved from Dean Street to Grafton Terrace, a small house in a more respectable neighborhood. But money still ran out instantly. When a small inheritance came, Marx spent it immediately. He couldn't manage money. He begged Engels for advances, begged publishers, begged relatives. Sometimes wished his rich uncles would die so he'd get the inheritance. He was a terrible administrator of his own life. But he worked. 16 years, from the 50s to 67, he wrote the first volume of Capital. He read everything he found: economists, chemists, geologists, mathematicians. He learned English and wrote for the American press, though he spoke with a heavy German accent his whole life. In 1867, the first volume finally came out in Hamburg. Sales were miserable. Marx admitted the book wouldn't even cover the cigars he'd smoked while writing it. But he didn't stop. He wrote the second and third volumes until his death, leaving thousands of pages of drafts. In the mid-60s, he became one of the founders of the First International. He wasn't an orator, didn't like public speaking. He wrote resolutions, programs, letters. He worked at his desk like he'd worked in Berlin, Paris, Brussels. The only difference, now he had a permanent address.
34 years in London. He became a British subject only formally, but remained stateless. No country claimed him.
In the 70s, his health gave out. Pleurisy, bronchitis, ulcers, abscesses on his lungs. He went for treatment to Carlsbad, the Isle of Wight, Algeria, Monte Carlo, Switzerland. Everywhere, rain and cold followed him. In Algeria in winter, it was colder than London. He wrote Engels that the weather was killing him faster than the disease. The final blow, Jenny's death in the early 80s. She died of cancer at 67. Karl never recovered. He came to the grave at Highgate Cemetery and couldn't leave. He said without her, life had lost meaning. She wasn't just a wife. She was his secretary, critic, ally, the only person who could read his illegible handwriting. Without Jenny, he wouldn't have written either the Manifesto or Capital. His eldest daughter, Jenny Longuet, died in early 1883. She was 38. Karl was shattered. He couldn't get up anymore. Bronchitis turned to pleurisy, pleurisy to lung abscess. March 14, 1883, 2:45 in the afternoon. Engels and Lenchen stepped out of the room for 2 minutes. When they came back, he sat in his armchair, head on his chest. Pulse stopped. He died in his sleep, without pain, at 64. At the funeral, there were 9 to 13 people. Engels gave a speech. He said Marx had discovered the law of motion of human history, as Darwin discovered the law of nature. But that was half the truth. The other half was this. The man who wrote about world revolution was buried quietly, without crowds, next to his wife, in a cemetery for atheists and agnostics. In his pocket, they found his father's daguerreotype. They put him in the coffin. But here's the strange thing. When Marx died, almost nobody read his books. The first volume of Capital sold in the hundreds. The Communist Manifesto came out in a few thousand copies and vanished. He was seen as a dangerous Jewish revolutionary, expelled from country to country. Nobody could have guessed that 30 years later, his ideas would change half the world. In 1917, Vladimir Lenin, sitting in a Swiss library, studied Capital and brought it to Russia. The October Revolution happened under slogans that grew out of Marxism. All power to the Soviets, peace to the peoples, land to the peasants. The USSR, China, Cuba, Eastern Europe, whole empires were built on schemes Marx had worked out in the museum reading room. Like if today some blogger in a basement wrote code that half the internet would run on a century later. But Marx's influence goes beyond revolutions. His book, Capital, became a weapon not in revolutionaries' hands, but in reformers. English factory inspectors quoted it in parliamentary debates, proving that a 16-hour workday kills workers. Trade unions used his arguments about the value of labor to demand an 8-hour day. In 1889, the Paris Congress of the Second International proclaimed May 1st, the day of struggle for the 8-hour workday. Today, we take it for granted, but it's not for granted. It's the result of someone proving working time isn't a gift from the boss, it's a commodity the worker sells and has the right not to sell below cost. Marx invented the word capital as a system, not just as money. He showed that the poverty of the rich and the wealth of the poor are two sides of the same mechanism. This idea outlived all revolutions. Today, economists who've never held capital in their hands use his terms: surplus value, exploitation, crisis of overproduction. Sociologists measure inequality using methods that grew out of his analysis. Even those who hate him speak his language. His influence is like that of a man who described a disease, but prescribed a medicine that killed. Revolutions done in Marx's name spawned dictatorships. But reforms growing from his books gave people weekends, daycare, pensions, sick leave. He wanted to destroy capitalism. Instead, he forced capitalism to change in order to survive. Have you ever thought that theory costs more than a coffin for a child? And if not, what are you willing to give for what you believe in? The world isn't changed by those who can count.